Lord Overcomer.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I do appreciate your indulgence. Just to wrap up a couple of technical points in respect of the Articles of Agreement. 31.2, the bank, its president's officers shall not interfere in the political affairs of any member, nor shall they be influenced in their decisions by the political character of the member concerned. Only economic considerations shall be resident to their decisions. Such considerations will be weighed impartially in order to achieve and carry on the purposes and functions of the bank. I really would like the Minister to share with the House some examples of the policies that the New Zealand Government would be expecting to see implemented under that all-important provision. Because for those, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, who've alleged that this new institution would be in some way a tool of creeping political influence, this safeguard would seem to weigh against that in a healthy and constructive way, but of course it's only as good as its implementation. So, Minister, if I can turn your attention to that very important clause in the Articles of Agreement, page 20 of the committee report, Article 31.2, how will we know, how will the New Zealand Governor know whether that has been implemented in practice, and how will it surface any concerns that might thus take place or subsequently take place? So there are a range of technical articles going on in Chapter 7, Chapter 8 around suspension and termination of operations of the bank, 9 staff immunities, privileges and exemptions, 10 various interpretive sections, and then in Chapter 11 signature and deposit ratification and enforcement provisions. Schedule A, the schedule to the schedule, which commences on page 30 of the committee report, on page 31, sets out New Zealand's relative number of shares, which I think interesting for us all to see, 4,615 shares, being US dollars 461.5. Now that raises a very important point, because of course earlier in this debate, the House has been tossing around the number 92 million US dollars, which converts to approximately 140 million New Zealand dollars. Here we see the actual liability as 461 million US dollars, closer, of course, to 600 and something, possibly close, I haven't calculated, close to 700 million New Zealand dollars. As they say in the language of governance, a non-trivial amount of liability, and it's instructive, sir, I think that comes from the Future Investment Fund, a fund of some 16 billion, 1/20th of which approximately would be covered by this liability if fully funded from it. That is, sir, a very significant proportion of the funds raised by the government's so-called mixed ownership model asset sales program, the proceeds of which were repeatedly stated to be for the development of New Zealand infrastructure and New Zealand health, education and social services. So, sir, if this, and it is a significant proportion of it, close to 1/20th of it, is instead to be allocated to the underwrite of the Asian International Bank, then the Infrastructure Investment Bank, then we need to know exactly what benefits will flow to New Zealand. And Minister, that takes, or through the Chair, I'd ask the Minister to comment on what estimates have been provided to the government on the economic flows to New Zealand that pertain to this subscription on page 31. Will it be a measurable flow of procurement services to New Zealand service providers? Will New Zealand qualify for infrastructure projects within New Zealand using AIIB funds? Now, Mr Joyce in question time today was celebrating the Crown's investment of 3 million New Zealand dollars in a harbour project in the Eastern Bay of Plenty. Sir, would that project, which of course is there to facilitate a marine farming proposal, Mr Chairman, Mr Chairman,
the Honourable David Cunliffe.
would that project, which is designed in the first instance to service, I think it's called Eastern Bay Farms, a large aquaculture project which I understand is around 50% owned by Chinese interests, would that have qualified for Asian infrastructure investment-backed funding if the government does not follow through on what it is quietly indicating may follow in time for the election, which is the balance of, I think, the $29 or $30 million required to make that project happen. And that raises in turn, sir, the larger question of whether other infrastructure projects in New Zealand would qualify for AIIB funding, because the government seems very reluctant to do major economic development regional infrastructure projects, except perhaps some roads. But even those have been concentrated in semi-urban roads of national significance, and regional roading has often been put on the back burner as a result. So I think that's an important question. Will New Zealand get consulting or service providing contracts from the procurement streams of this bank? If so, do we have any idea how much? Will New Zealand service providers be eligible to provide infrastructure construction and expertise in third-party countries? Just for example, some of our SOEs are world best practice, I understand, in geothermal technology. Will that qualify? If so, what estimates have been made in our national interest analysis about the cash flow back to New Zealand? Because $461 million of liability out of the government's future investment fund, so-called, is a big chunk of change. What are we getting for it? Now, that's not to say that Labor opposes the bill. We support the bill, and I've taken some time to go through the Articles of Agreement to indicate provisions that we are by and large comfortable with, and indeed New Zealand has materially contributed to. We are comforted, sir, with the proscription on political interference. We are comforted with the well set out transparency requirements and the layering of the role of the Board of Governors on which New Zealand will sit and the Board of Directors. But we ask exactly what level of transparency will be provided to the governors in terms of the operations of the bank as opposed to the directors, on which it's less likely that we will sit, and what estimates have been provided to the cash flow benefits of New Zealand. And I have to say that once again the national interest analysis that was provided to the Select Committee was more kindly put, qualitative, well written, but qualitative than quantitative. That is, there's no numbers in it. It says, and the committee has summarised, that New Zealand's economic future is linked to the Asian region, and therefore it's a good thing for us to participate. It's a very general argument, sir, and in this committee stage debate, drawing upon the Articles of Association, I think it's incumbent on us to try to get into the detail of that so that we can see what attempt has been made by the government to quantify those benefits. It talks about, page 3 of the Select Committee report, connectivity to the market. Beginning with the truism that New Zealand is part of Asia. Yes, of course it is, but that argument alone is not sufficient to justify our involvement in this. And it talks about our ability to influence, but even the national interest analysis doesn't go into the point we've just made in these contributions, that we sit on the Board of Governors, but not necessarily the Board of Directors, and that therefore there is a limitation on the influence that we can bring to bear. So on both the financial and the non-financial returns, I would ask the Minister to take a brief call. What quantum has been provided to the government in terms of financial returns to New Zealand service providers, and what level of transparency, sir, pertains to the governors as opposed to the directors on the strategy, direction and operations of the bank? Thank you, Mr Chairman.